Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to two new members of our Patreon family, Mark and Shannon. Thank you both so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive monthly episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're returning to a wonderful exploration of the past. The Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt for the use of students and travelers by Gaston Camille Charles Maspero, DCL Oxford. Member of the Institute of France, professor at the Collège de France, ex-director general of Egyptian museums, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. Published in 1895 in a new edition revised and enlarged by the author, with 309 illustrations. Let's pick up where we left off, in Chapter 2, Religious Architecture. Section 3, Decoration. Ancient tradition affirmed that the earliest Egyptian temples contained neither sculptured images, inscriptions, nor symbols, and in point of fact, the Temple of the Sphinx is bare. But this is a unique example. The fragments of architraves and masonry bearing the name of Khafra, which were used for building material in the northern pyramid of Lisht, show that this primitive simplicity had already been abandoned by the time of the 4th dynasty. During the Theban period, all smooth surfaces, all pylons, wall faces, and shafts of columns were covered with figure groups and inscriptions. Under the Ptolemies and the Caesars, figures and hieroglyphs became so crowded that the stone on which they are sculptured seems to be lost under the masses of ornament with which it is charged. We recognize at a glance that these scenes are not placed at random. They follow in sequence, are interlinked, and form, as it were, a great mystic book in which the official relations between gods and men, as well as between men and gods, are clearly set forth for such as are skilled to read them. The temple was built in the likeness of the world, as the world was known to the Egyptians. The earth, as they believed, was a flat and shallow plain, longer than its width. The sky, according to some, extended overhead like an immense iron ceiling, and according to others, like a huge, shallow vault. As it could not remain suspended in space without some support, they imagined it to be held in place by 4 immense props or pillars. The floor of the temple naturally represented the earth. The columns, and if needful, the four corners of the chambers stood for the pillars. The roof, vaulted at Abydos, flat elsewhere, corresponded exactly with the Egyptian idea of the sky. Each of these parts was, therefore, decorated in consonance with its meaning. Those next to the ground were clothed with vegetation. The bases of the columns were surrounded by leaves, and the lower parts of the walls were adorned with long stems of lotus or papyrus, in the midst of which animals were occasionally depicted. Bouquets of water plants, emerging from the water, enlivened the bottom of the wall space in certain chambers. Elsewhere we find full-blown flowers interspersed with buds, or tied together with cords, or those emblematic plants which symbolize the union of Upper and Lower Egypt under the rule of a single pharaoh, or birds with human hands and arms perched in an attitude of adoration on the sign which represents a solemn festival, or kneeling prisoners tied to the stake in couples, each couple consisting of an Asiatic and an African. Male and female Niles, laden with flowers and fruits, either kneel or advance in majestic procession along the ground level. These are the nomes, lakes, and districts of Egypt, bringing offerings of their products to the god. In one instance at Karnak, Thutmose III caused the fruits, flowers, and animals indigenous to the foreign lands which he had conquered to be sculptured on the lower courses of his walls. The ceilings were painted blue and sprinkled with 5 pointed stars painted yellow, occasionally interspersed with the cartouches of the royal founder. The monotony of this Egyptian heaven was also relieved by long bands of hieroglyphic inscription. The vultures of Nekeb and Uati, the goddesses of the south and north, crowned and armed with divine emblems, hovered above the nave of the hypostyle halls, and on the underside of the lintels of the great doors, above the head of the king as he passed through on his way to the sanctuary. At the Ramesseum, at Edfu, at Philae, at Dendera, at Ombos, at Esne, the depths of the firmament seemed to open to the eyes of the faithful, revealing the dwellers therein. There the celestial ocean poured forth its floods, navigated by the sun and moon, with their attendant escort of planets, constellations, and decani, and there also the genii of the months and days marched in long procession. In the Ptolemaic age, zodiacs fashioned after Greek models were sculptured side by side with astronomical tables of purely native origin. The decoration of the architraves, which supported the massive roofing slabs, was entirely independent of that of the ceiling itself. On these were wrought nothing save boldly cut inscriptions, in which the beauty of the temple, the names of the builder kings who had erected it, and the glory of the gods to whom it was consecrated are emphatically celebrated. Finally, the decoration of the lowest part of the walls and of the ceiling was restricted to a small number of subjects, which were always similar, the most important and varied scenes being suspended, as it were, between earth and heaven, on the sides of the chambers and the pylons. These scenes illustrate the official relations which subsisted between Egypt and the gods. The people had no right of direct intercourse with the deities. they needed a mediator who, partaking of both human and divine nature, was qualified to communicate with both. The king alone, son of the sun, was of sufficiently high descent to contemplate the god in his temple, to serve him, and to speak with him face to face. Sacrifices could be offered only by him or through him and in his name. Even the customary offerings to the dead were supposed to pass through his hands, and the family availed themselves of his name in the formula Sutin Tahotep to forward them to the other world. The king is seen, therefore, in all parts of the temple, standing, seated, kneeling, slaying the victim, presenting the parts, pouring out the wine, the milk, and the oil, and burning the incense. All humankind acts through him, and through him performs its duty towards the gods. When the ceremonies to be performed required the assistance of many persons, then alone did mortal subordinates, consisting as much as possible of his own family, appear by his side. The queen, standing behind him like Isis behind Osiris, uplifts her hand to protect him, shakes the sistrum, beats the tambourine to dispel evil spirits, or holds the libation vase or bouquet. The eldest son carries the net or lassos the bull and recites the prayer, while his father successively presents to the god each object prescribed by the ritual. A priest may occasionally act as substitute for the prince, but other men perform only the most menial offices. They are slaughterers or servants, or they bear the boat or canopy of the god. The god, for his part, is not always alone. He has his wife and his son by his side. Next after them the gods of the neighboring homes, and in a general way, all the gods of Egypt. From the moment that the temple is regarded as representing the world, it must, like the world, contain all gods, both great and small. They are most frequently ranged behind the principal god, seated or standing, and with him they share in the homage paid by the king. Sometimes, however, they take an active part in the ceremonies. The spirits of On and Khonu kneel before the sun and proclaim his praise. Hor, Set, or Thoth conduct Pharaoh into the presence of his father, Amen-Ra, or performs the functions elsewhere assigned to the prince or the priest. They help him to overthrow the victim or to snare birds for the sacrifice. And in order to wash away his impurities, they pour upon his head the waters of youth and life. The position and functions of these cooperating gods were strictly defined in the theology. The sun, traveling from east to west, divided the universe into two worlds, the world of the north and the world of the south. The temple, like the universe, was double, and an imaginary line passing through the axis of the sanctuary divided it into two temples, the temple of the south on the right hand, and the temple of the north on the left. The gods and their various manifestations were divided between these two temples, according as they belonged to the northern or southern hemisphere. This fiction of duality was carried yet further. Each chamber was divided in imitation of the temple into two halves, the right half belonging to the south and the left half to the north. the royal homage, to be complete, must be rendered in the temples of the south and of the north, and to the gods of the south and of the north, and with the products of the south and of the north. Each sculptured tableau must, therefore, be repeated at least twice in each temple, on a right wall and on a left wall. Amen on the right receives the corn, the wine, the liquids of the south, while on the left he receives the corn, the wine, and the liquids of the north. As with Amen, so with Mot, Khonsu, Mentu, and many other gods. Want of space frequently frustrated the due execution of this scheme, and we often meet with a tableau in which the products of north and south together are placed before an Amen who represents both Amen of the south and Amen of the north. These departures from decorative usage are, however, exceptional, and the dual symmetry is always observed where space permits. In Pharaonic times, the tableaux were not overcrowded. The wall surface intended to be covered was marked off below by a line carried just above the ground level decoration, and was bounded above by the usual cornice or by a frieze. This frieze might be composed of uraei, or of bunches of lotus, or of royal cartouches supported on either side by divine symbols, or of emblems borrowed from the local cult, by heads of Hathor, for instance, in a temple dedicated to Hathor, or of a horizontal line of dedicatory inscription engraved in large and deeply cut hieroglyphs. The wall space thus framed in contains sometimes a single scene and sometimes two scenes, one above the other. The wall must be very lofty if this number is exceeded. Figures and inscriptions were widely spaced, and the scenes succeeded one another with scarcely a break. The spectator had to discover for himself where they began or ended. The head of the king was always studied from life, and the faces of the gods reproduced the royal portrait as closely as possible. As Pharaoh was the son of the gods, the surest way to obtain portraits of the gods was to model their faces after the face of the king. The secondary figures were no less carefully wrought, but when these were very numerous, they were arranged on 2 or 3 levels, the total height of which never exceeded that of the principal personages. The offerings, the scepters, the jewels, the vestments, the headdresses, and all the accessories were treated with a genuine feeling for elegance and truth. The colors, moreover, were so combined as to produce in each tableau the effect of one general and prevailing tone, so that in many temples there were chambers which can be justly distinguished as the blue hall, the red hall, or the golden hall. So much for the classical period of decoration. As we come down to later times, these tableaux are multiplied, and under the Greeks and Romans, they become so numerous that the smallest wall contained not less than 4, 5, 6, or even 8 registers. The principal figures are, as it were, compressed, so as to occupy less room, and all the intermediate space is crowded with thousands of tiny hieroglyphs. The gods and kings are no longer portraits of the reigning sovereign, but mere conventional types, without vigor or life. As for the secondary figures and accessories, The sculptor's only care is to crowd in as many as possible. This was not due to a defect of taste, and to the prevalence of a religious idea which decided but enforced these changes. The object of decoration was not merely the delight of the eye. Applied to a piece of furniture, a coffin, a house, a temple, decoration possessed a certain magic property, of which the power and nature were determined by each being or action represented, by each word inscribed or spoken at the moment of consecration. Every subject was therefore an amulet as well as an ornament. So long as it endured, it ensured to the god the continuance of homage rendered or sacrifices offered by the king. To the king, whether living or dead, it confirmed the favors granted to him by the god in recompense for his piety. It also preserved from destruction the very wall upon which it was depicted. At the time of the 18th dynasty, it was thought that 2 or 3 such amulets sufficed to compass the desired effect, but at a later period, it was believed that their number could not be too freely multiplied, and the walls were covered with as many as the surface would contain. An average chamber of Edfu or Dendera yields more material for study than the hypostyle hall of Karnak, and the chapel of Antoninus Pius at Philae, had it been finished, would have contained more scenes than the sanctuary of Luxor and the passages by which it is surrounded. Observing the variety of subjects treated on the walls of any one temple, one might at first be tempted to think that the decoration does not form a connected whole, and that, although many series of scenes must undoubtedly contain the development of an historic idea or a religious dogma, yet that others are merely strung together without any necessary link. At Luxor, and again at the Ramesseum, each face of the pylon is a battlefield on which may be studied almost day for day the campaign of Ramses II against the Kheta, which took place in the 5th year of his reign. There we see the Egyptian camp attacked by night, the king's bodyguard surprised during the march, the defeat of the enemy, their flight, the garrison of Kadesh sallying forth to the relief of the vanquished, and the disasters which befell the prince of the Kheta and his generals. Elsewhere it is not the war which is represented, but the human sacrifices which anciently celebrated the close of each campaign. The king is seen in the act of seizing his prostrate prisoners by the hair of their heads and uplifting his mace as if about to shatter their heads at a single blow. At Karnak, along the whole length of the outer wall, Seti I pursues the Bedouin of Sinai. At Medinet Habu, Ramses III destroys the fleet of the peoples of the Great Sea, or receives the cut-off hands of the Libyans, which his soldiers bring to him as trophies. In the next scene all is peace, and we behold Pharaoh pouring out a libation of perfumed water to his father Amen. It would seem as if no link could be established between these subjects, and yet the one is the necessary consequence of the other. If the god had not granted victory to the king in his turn would not have performed these ceremonies in the temple. The sculptor has recorded the events in their order. First the victory, then the sacrifice. The favor of the god precedes the thank offering of the king. Thus, on closer examination, we find this multitude of episodes forming the several links of one continuous chain, while every scene, including such as seem at first sight to be wholly unexplained, represents one stage in the development of a single action which begins at the door, is carried through the various halls, and penetrates to the farthest recesses of the sanctuary. The king enters the temple. In the courts, he is everywhere confronted by reminiscences of his victories, and here the god comes forth to greet him, hidden in his shrine and surrounded by priests. The rites prescribed for these occasions are graven on the walls of the hypostyle hall in which they were performed. These being over, king and god together take their way to the sanctuary. At the door which leads from the public hall to the mysterious part of the temple, the escort halts. The king crosses the threshold alone and is welcomed by the gods. He then performs in due order all the sacred ceremonies enjoined by usage. His merits increase by virtue of his prayers. His senses become exalted. He rises to the level of the divine type. Finally, he enters the sanctuary, where the god reveals himself unwitnessed and speaks to him face to face. The sculptures faithfully reproduced the order of this mystic presentation. The welcoming reception on the part of the god, the acts and offerings of the king, the vestments which he puts on and off in succession, the various crowns which he places on his head, the prayers which he recites, and the favors which are conferred upon him are also recorded upon the walls in order of time and place. The king and the few who accompany him have their backs towards the entrance and their faces towards the door of the sanctuary. The gods, on the contrary, or at least such as do not make part of the procession, face the entrance and have their backs turned toward the sanctuary. If during the ceremony the royal memory failed, the king needed but to raise his eyes to the wall, whereupon his duties were mapped out for him. Each part of the temple had its accessory decoration and its furniture. The outer faces of the pylons were ornamented, not only with the masts and streamers before mentioned, but with statues and obelisks. The statues, 4 or 6 in number, were of limestone, granite, or sandstone. They invariably represented the royal founder and were sometimes of prodigious size. The 2 Memnons seated at the entrance of the temple of Amenhotep III at Thebes measured about 50 feet in height. The colossal Ramses II of the Ramesseum measured 57 feet, and that of Tanis at least 70 feet. The greater number, however, did not exceed 20 feet. They mounted guard before the temple, facing outwards, as if confronting an approaching enemy. The obelisks of Karnak are mostly hidden amid the central courts, and those of Queen Hatshepsut were embedded for 17 feet of their height in masses of masonry which concealed their bases. These are accidental circumstances and easy of explanation. Each of the pylons before which they are stationed had in its turn been the entrance to the temple, and was thrown into the rear by the works of succeeding pharaohs. The true place of all obelisks was in front of the colossi on each side of the main entrance. They are always in pairs, but often of unequal height. Some have professed to see in them the emblem of Amen the generator, or a finger of the god, or a ray of the sun. In sober truth, they are a more shapely form of the standing stone or menhir, which is raised by semi-civilized peoples in commemoration of their gods or their dead. Small obelisks, about 3 feet in height, are found in tombs as early as the 4th dynasty. They are placed right and left of the stela, that is to say, on either side of the door which leads to the dwelling of the dead. Erected before the pylon gates of temples, they are made of granite, and their dimensions are considerable. The obelisk of Heliopolis measures 68 feet in the shaft, and the obelisks of Luxor stand 77 and 75.5 feet high, respectively. The loftiest known is the obelisk of Queen Hatshepsut at Karnak, which rises to a height of 109 feet. To convey such masses and to place them in equilibrium was a sufficiently difficult task, and one is at a loss to understand how the Egyptians succeeded in erecting them with no other appliances than ropes and sacks of sand. Queen Hatshepsut boasts that her obelisks were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected in 7 months, and we have no reason to doubt the truth of her statement. Obelisks were almost always square, with the faces slightly convex, and a slight slope from top to bottom. The pedestal was formed of a single square block adorned with inscriptions, or with cynocephali in high relief adoring the sun. The point was cut as a pyramidion, and sometimes covered with bronze or gilt copper. Scenes of offerings to Ra Harmarchis, Hor, Tum, or Amen are engraved on the sides of the pyramidion and on the upper part of the prism. The 4 upright faces are generally decorated with only vertical lines of inscription in praise of the king. Such is the usual type of obelisk, but we here and there meet with exceptions. That of Begig in the Fayum is in shape of a rectangular oblong with a blunt top. A groove upon it shows that it was surmounted by some emblem in metal, perhaps a hawk, like the obelisk represented on a funerary stela in the Giza Museum. This form, which like the first is a survival of the menhir, was in vogue till the last days of Egyptian art. It is even found at Axum in the middle of Ethiopia, dating from about the 4th century of our era, at a time when in Egypt the ancient obelisks were being carried out of the country, and none dreamed of erecting new ones. Such was the accessory decoration of the pylon. The inner courts and hypostyle halls of the temple contained more colossi. Some, placed with their backs against the outer sides of pillars or walls, were half engaged in the masonry and built up in courses. At Luxor under the peristyle, and at Karnak between each column of the great nave, were also placed statues of Pharaoh, but these were statues of Pharaoh the victor, clad in his robe of state. The right of consecrating a statue in the temple was above all a royal prerogative. Yet the king sometimes permitted private persons to dedicate their statues by the side of his own. This was, however, a special favor, and such monuments always bear an inscription stating that it is by the king's grace that they occupy that position. Rarely as this privilege was granted, it resulted in a vast accumulation of votive statues, so that in the course of centuries, the courts of some temples became crowded with them. At Karnak, the sanctuary enclosure was furnished outside with a kind of broad bench, breast high, like a long base. Upon this the statues were placed with their backs to the wall. Attached to each was an oblong block of stone with a projecting spout on one side. These are known as tables of offerings. The upper face is more or less hollowed and is often sculptured with bas-relief representations of loaves, joints of beef, libation vases, and other objects usually presented to the dead or to gods. Those of King Ameni-Entef-Amenemhat at Giza are blocks of red granite more than 3 feet in length, the top of which is hollowed out in regular rows of cup holes, each cup hole being reserved for one particular offering. There was, in fact, an established form of worship provided for statues, and these tables were really altars upon which were deposited sacrificial offerings of meat, cakes, fruits, vegetables, and the like. The sanctuary and the surrounding chambers contained the objects used in the ceremonial of worship. The bases of altars varied in shape, some being square and massive, others polygonal or cylindrical. Some of these last are in form not unlike a small cannon, which is the name given to them by the Arabs. The most ancient are those of the 5th dynasty. The most beautiful is one dedicated by Seti I, now in the Giza Museum. The only perfect specimen of an altar known to me was discovered at Menshia in 1884. It is of white limestone, hard and polished like marble. It stands upon a pedestal in the form of a long cone, having no other ornament than a torus about half an inch below the top. Upon this pedestal, in a hollow specially prepared for its reception, stands a large hemispherical basin. The shrines are little chapels of wood or stone, in which the spirit of the deity was supposed at all times to dwell, and which on ceremonial occasions contained his image. The sacred barks were built after the model of the bari, or boat, in which the sun performed his daily course. The shrine was placed amidship of the boat, and covered with a veil or curtain to conceal its contents from all spectators. The crew were also represented, each god being at his post of duty, the pilot at the helm, the lookout at the prow, the king upon his knees before the door of the shrine. We have not as yet discovered any of the statues employed in the ceremonial, but we know what they were like, what part they played, and of what materials they were made. They were animated, and in addition to their bodies of stone, metal, or wood, they had each a soul magically derived from the soul of the divinity which they represented. They spoke, moved, acted, not metaphorically, but actually. The later Ramessids ventured upon no enterprises without consulting them. They stated their difficulties, and the god replied to each question by a movement of the head. According to the Stela of Bakhtan, a statue of Khonsu places its hands 4 times on the nape of the neck of another statue, so transmitting the power of expelling demons. It was after a conversation with the statue of Amen in the dusk of the sanctuary that Queen Hatshepsut dispatched her squadron to the shores of the land of incense. Theoretically, the divine soul of the image was understood to be the only miracle worker. Practically, its speech and motion were the results of a pious fraud. Interminable avenues of sphinxes, gigantic obelisks, massive pylons, halls of 100 columns, mysterious chambers of perpetual night. In a word, the whole Egyptian temple and its dependencies were built by way of a hiding place for a performing puppet, of which the wires were worked by a priest. And on that rather cynical note, we've reached the end of the chapter, so that seems as good a place as any to end this evening's reading from the Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt. When next we return to this book, we'll be venturing into the world of tombs, so that's something to look forward to. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many illustrations, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from a book we've already started, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.